Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 43. I'm Enigmius, and today we're finally closing in the last bits of the Serpovectem's hull, excluding the back end because we're going to have some engines sticking out the back, and I don't want to close it up if I'm just going to have to rip it open again. This ended up being a bit more time consuming than I'd really expected. There was a lot of, as you'll see, placing things and then removing them and then placing different things and then just trying to figure out the best way to make everything come together so that we close in. It's just this little narrow section along the front of the ship that we have to worry about, and everything is done. It's taken care of. But it's a matter of getting both parts to line up in a way that I'm happy with. I should be a little bit quicker for this kind of thing at this point, but sometimes it takes a little while for certain lessons to sink in. You can see what I'm doing here is I'm working with very, very narrow strips. Working with strips is very normal. It's the way that I tend to do these things because it's just easier, in my mind at least, to put things together if we keep them a little bit orderly like that. But instead of doing these little narrow strips front to back, I should be doing strips side to side and just kind of bringing everything together that way, because that's really where the challenge is we're trying to stitch together these two parts of the ship, but we're doing it the wrong way. And eventually what happens is I kind of catch on to this and I start doing things side to side, and the end result is basically the goal, the outcome that we were looking for, just by swapping things around in the approach the way that we did. It's kind of weird the way things work out that way. The solution, sometimes we're using the wrong kinds of blocks, and the solution obviously is to start using the right kinds of blocks. Sometimes the problem is that we're dealing with geometry that's impossible. The game won't allow us to create the shape that we're looking for simply by nature of the shapes that are available to us. And the solution there is to change the design so that we can do it with the geometry that we have available to us. And sometimes the problem is our approach, and the solution is to adjust our approach to make things a little bit more conducive to what we're trying to do. And that was the case here, obviously. You'll get an example a little bit later in the video of a situation where the problem is not having the necessary geometry in the game in order to create the shapes that we're looking for, and it actually ends up being the shapes that I was talking about in the last episode about the individual, I think it was on Reddit, who was talking about a shape that they really wanted to see in the game, and it was genuinely a shape that's not in the game, and a shape that would be quite useful in certain limited circumstances, which is why I'm not necessarily expecting that it'll be added, because it is sort of a niche specialized block. But it is one of those blocks where if you don't have it and you find a situation where it would be useful, it would be incredibly useful, as opposed to sometimes you end up with blocks in repertoire that's available to you that you never use because they're specialized, and you rarely find yourself in this situation where you'd want to use them. And this here is an example of the problem that I encountered that would be solved by doing these in strips side to side instead of front to back, where we built down from the top section a little ways and then we built up from the side section a little ways, and they didn't line up. And I had the choice to make at that point whether or not that inability to line up with the way that we had done things was acceptable with the geometry that it created. It had sort of like a edge, almost like a fin, sort of extending front to back, where maybe we could get things to line up and maybe not, or we could push our luck and go for something that's a little bit more uniform and a little bit easier to fit, and a little less jarring. There are some situations we come across a happy sort of mistake, I guess you could call it. We didn't really plan it, but when we look at it, we say, yeah, that looks kind of neat. And then there are other times when we try and make excuses for our mistakes and say, yeah, that's not at all what I had in mind. But, you know, if you look at it in the right, you know, from the right angle in pitch black darkness, doesn't look too bad. I can live with it. This would have been one of those cases where I would have been looking at it and seeing, yeah, that's the spot that we screwed up on, and we didn't line up properly and we just left it. So I decided to spend a little bit of time reworking it and getting it a little bit closer to what we had in mind. There's going to be some exposed faces in a few different locations where the seams didn't quite line up and I couldn't quite get them to line up. And they were small enough and not prominent enough that I was able to say, okay, we can live with that. We don't even have to try and pass it off as a design feature because it's not that big of a deal. You're not really going to see it all that often. So I just left it. And ultimately, the front end of the ship worked out fairly well. Pretty happy with it. I didn't want anything crazy. I didn't want anything overly intricate at this point. Now we get to move on to this elliptical section in the back of the ship, and this is what happens when I get in over my head and don't realize it until we're really in over our heads. What I'm doing now specifically, and I left this sped up to the really fast thing just because we're doing a little bit of pre-work. I wanted to connect the elliptical section to the rest of the ship and remove the original blocks that we had holding everything together, because I knew that we weren't keeping those at all. And I just kind of wanted to get things started to the point where we're working now with permanent features, permanent structural elements that will be a part of the ship right the way through until it's complete. So you can see we've got these horizontal pieces connecting the side of the ship to the inner side of the ellipse. And then I'm just kind of building it out a little bit. I had an idea, and I still plan to pursue that idea. Even though it's turning out to be a much more difficult situation than I envisioned, where basically what I wanted to do is I wanted to put another ellipse, just basically the same profile as the one that we've currently got, scaled down a little bit. And I wanted to put it on the inside of this one. And then when we block up between those two, we end up with kind of like a three-dimensional ellipse instead of just this flat sort of one-dimensional shape almost that we've got currently. From that, the idea came to mind that I would have it a little bit thicker at the polar sections. So the very top, the very bottom, and to either side, that 3D element would be just a little bit thicker to the inside, just to add a little bit of visual interest to make it look like there was something going on there aside from just having this ellipse welded to the ship for no apparent reason. Maybe we could fill it with engines and have the engine glow out the back. Maybe we could just fill it with other equipment. Maybe we could not fill it with anything and just have it there as an additional detail. It's not like we were without options in terms of what we would do with that, but the thing that I kind of didn't really consider is that we built this on a slope. It's not straight up and down, it's on a slope, and it's a very simple pattern for the slope. It's two of those cubes that we've been using to measure everything against this whole way through, and then it steps out, and then it's two cubes, and then it steps out, and then it's two cubes. So it's very simple repeating pattern that defines that slope on both the front and the back of the ellipse. And then we've got obviously the round profile for the ellipse itself. And now we've got to sort of build it out so that this inner section lines up properly with the outer section, both with the shape, the profile of the ellipse, and with the slope to the front and back, and with the changing thickness in these polar locations. It gets to be a little bit tricky just lining everything up and making sure that the slope is the same. And not only is the slope the same, but that the components that we're placing for this inside ellipse are the same length as the corresponding components on the outside. And hopefully that makes sense. I mean, basically we just have to get the geometry to line up is the short way of saying all of that. The difficulty is that it's just, again, we're talking about compound curves, we're talking about intersecting slopes on curved things, and we're working at a very granular level to get everything to line up. You can see I'm working with just little wee strips. You know, they may be long strips, but they're not high, they're not thick, they're just long strips. And then there are certain points where they're just that height of a cube. Right now, most of the ones we've been working with have been at least 2 cubes high. But we get to a point where, because of the way the angles start working to work its way around the curve of that ellipse, we've only got 1 block that we're working with, and then we have to step it out in order to get everything to line up. It's a lot. I expected it to go together a lot faster, I think, was the main thing. And then after spending a certain amount of time working on it and looking at what I had achieved, I was really surprised that it had taken that long to get this far. So what I think I'm going to do, in the interest of saving a little bit of time and keeping the pace up, is I'm just going to rough in the interior, the inner ellipse, just get it structurally all in without worrying about smoothing it off, without worrying about finishing off the edges on the front and the back. Just get it roughed in, then add in the thicker segments and those sort of polar areas, then finish everything with the slopes so that it's smooth and it's supposed to be, you know, it is what it's supposed to be. That, to me, is probably the most sensible way to go about it, and will probably ultimately involve the least amount of time. It's not that I'm opposed to spending time, it's just there are certain tasks, they kind of wear on you after a little while. You get a little bit fatigued and you start envisioning what it will be like when it's done, and then when you realize how far you are from being done, it's a bit of a shock. So there's different ways we can go about correcting that. One of them is sort of batching tasks. You have, for example, the task of going around and just roughing in this inner ellipse. That will be one task that you can do. It's repetitive, but once you get going, once you kind of get into the groove, it goes much, much quicker because it's repetitive, and you don't have to worry about changing gears, going to different tasks. Once you get everything roughed in, then you go back and you start filling things in, changing things, making the special details, etc., etc., doing those as individual tasks for the same reason. You just get into the groove and everything goes much faster. And I think if I go about it that way, we'll be in good shape. And not only that, but it will allow me to do the extra high-speed footage for roughing in the ellipse, because it's such a straightforward process, and then bring it back down to this speed for the final details. And you can see I'm spending a little bit of time here just experimenting to get a feel for how it will look when we start smoothing things off and closing things in. And this is where you'll start to see the opportunity for those specialized shapes, that specific specialized shape. It's just a very difficult shape to describe, but once you come across it, you know what it is. It's one of those things you know almost instinctively that's the shape, the mystery shape that we don't have, that we can't duplicate by any other means. So I think the ship is progressing very nicely. I'm very, very happy to have basically the main part of the hull closed in, obviously, except for the very tail end. And there's probably going to be even more on the tail end that we open up. We'll see. And I also started messing around with placing some directional thrusters just to kind of get a feel for how much space we're going to need for directional thrusters in order to get a reasonable measure of performance out of the ship once it's complete. And it's actually, so far, it doesn't appear to be too bad. So we're going to continue messing around with that as we go. It's nice to have an idea where we sit, as opposed to, sometimes I like to wait until the very end and do things, but this is definitely, we're at a spot now where it makes sense to start experimenting with the performance components of the ship. So we'll be doing that as well. So there's just a couple minutes left here, kind of filling things in, giving you a feel for what's going on and the direction that we're headed. If you want to be notified about the next and other videos in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.